Did you know there's a group of native plants which can be highly adaptable, can serve multiple functions in our gardens, and perhaps even be a backbone component to our home landscapes, but which has historically been overlooked for those purposes? Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Before we get started, I want to thank all of my supporters on Patreon. Their monthly donations help make Backyard Ecology possible. If you would like to join them, you can do so for less than the cost of a cup of coffee or a meal at your favorite fast food place. I'll have links in the show notes for the Backyard Ecology Patreon page, blog, YouTube channel, and email list. Today we're talking to Sam Hoadley. Sam is the Manager of Horticultural Research at Cuba Center in Delaware. Hi, Sam. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank
Hi,
you for
Shannon.
talking with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation because we're going to be talking about a group of native plants that aren't used in the garden setting very often, especially compared with a lot of the other types of native plants. But before we get into that, can you tell us a little bit about what you do and how you got interested in growing native plants?
Yeah, sure. So I manage the trial gardens here at Cuba Center, where we're looking at native species and cultivars from two different perspectives. We're looking at them from an ornamental perspective. So will this be a beautiful garden plant? Is it adaptable to gardens in the Mid-Atlantic region? But we're also looking at it from wildlife value perspective. So we want to be able to know, are these various species and cultivars valuable to wildlife? Are they going to be able to potentially support insects, birds, butterflies, things like that in a home landscape? With Carex, it was a little bit difficult to look at that perspective, but most often we are looking at those two different perspectives when we're looking at any of our native plants that we're evaluating. And that all ties back to our mission at Cuba Center, which is to inspire people by the beauty and value of native plants. So you think about the beauty, ornamental qualities, value, the wildlife and ecological value of these various species of cultivars. So that's what we do, and in a nutshell, the kind of the overview of what I do in the trial garden. As far as me being interested in natives, I've always had a love for native plants. I think I in a way grew up in the woods when I was younger. My mom was always out there with me, showing me plants. I was learning plants in the wild, in the woods, and that kind of instilled that first interest in me. And throughout my career, it was always kind of a piece of my career. But, since joining Cuba Center and being here, it has really become the focus, of course, in doing this work. And native plants have really become central to my life at home and at Cuba Center.
And that's one of the things I really like about Cuba Center and what they're doing, the research they're doing, is that when you guys look at the cultivars, you're actually testing them against the straight species. You're actually looking at how valuable this is to pollinators and wildlife. And it gives us some data points. It may not tell us, okay, all cultivars of the species do this or do that, but it at least gives us a baseline of, okay, this cultivar does this or doesn't do that. And it gives us something to test by. It gives us a little bit of a data point, something more than, oh, well, I'm just going to assume or guess.
Yeah, it gives you a good starting point, and it helps to make informed decisions. Now, is it the answer to everything? Definitely not. There's a million other questions that could be answered, but it is a good starting point. And we start to see trends emerge as we do more and more of these trials, in terms of which cultivars might have more value than others. But it really can be a mixed bag, and it is important to be doing this kind of work, not just here, but it should be done much more broadly. And there is, I think, a lack of the data that we're collecting out there in the world as a whole.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. Okay, how are the trials conducted? And I guess kind of talk in general to start with, and then we'll narrow down to the Carexes and the current trial that you just completed.
Sure. So trials generally run from 3 to 5 years. 3 is our kind of standard model for herbaceous perennials. although we're starting to move into the more of a 4-year category. We find that 3 years is a good length of time, but it's not quite long enough to be able to tell if a plant is short-lived or long-lived. In cultivation, 4 years, you start to learn things that you wouldn't have necessarily seen in those first 3, which is something we saw in the Carex trial for sure. And then 5 years is our general model so far with woody plants. So far we've evaluated our wild hydrangeas or hydrangea arborescens and their allies. And we just started an oak leaf hydrangea trial, which will be a 5-year evaluation as well. So during those 3 or 5 years, we are collecting yearly data, and that data is really kind of focused during the growing season. I like to say it's most often between May all the way through to September, although with later blooming trials such as our goldenrods or ironweeds or things like that, we're going to skew later. With Carex, some of those plants are blooming in early to mid-March, so we have to skew a little bit earlier, but we're generally trying to capture that growing season. And during that growing season, we're evaluating those plants on a weekly basis. We're taking observations, we're taking pictures, we are taking measurements, and rating these plants in several different categories. One rating is given every single week while we're watching these plants over that growing season. This is the overall plant score. And all of our scores, as far as this rating system is concerned, range from a 1 to 5. So just to kind of calibrate you on the scale, 1 is the lowest score you could achieve, 5 is the highest score you could achieve. So 5 is a really excellent plant, 1 is a very poor plant, and 3 is average. So 3 is not a bad score at all. And there's plenty of 3s in the trial garden that I would love to have in my home garden. But most often the plants that we promote at the end of the trials land somewhere between the 4 and 5 range. So these are really, really excellent plants. So the overall plant score, which we assign on a weekly basis for the entire year or for the entire growing season, this kind of takes into account habit, form, all of those things that that plant is doing when it's not necessarily in bloom. When the plant is in bloom, with most trials, then we're assigning a separate rating on the ornamental qualities of those flowers. So flower coverage, bloom duration, just other ornamental qualities that that plant might have, that cultivar or that species. So that's another rating of a 1 to 5. And then in a lot of trials, we're actually looking at disease resistance as well. So this is really important when we're thinking about Monarda or phlox, thinking about powdery mildew resistance, or with the ironweed, looking at rust resistance. And that's, again, on a scale of 1 to 5. So 5 would be a very resistant plant. 1 would be a plant that has almost no resistance. And generally, at the end of that season, we have all these weekly scores between our overall plant scores, flower scores, disease resistance scores, and those are all averaged together in kind of a weighted average. So about 50% of that score is taken up by the overall score, 25% by the flower, and 25% by the disease resistance. And that's kind of how we end up with our yearly scores. And then all of those yearly scores, whether there's 3 or 5 of them, are then averaged together, and that's how we determine those top 10 or those top performing plants that we will eventually feature in our research reports that are available as hard copies here or online as well on our website.
And you were talking about evaluating for pollinator and wildlife usage. How does
Yes.
that play into it?
Yeah, so that is a primarily volunteer-driven process. So we guide them, we make the surveys, we train the volunteers on this process, and we actually collect some of the data on kind of the tail ends of the season. But during the meat of that season, when those plants are blooming, we have a volunteer from the Pollinator Watch team who's coming out on a nearly daily basis and are observing all of the plants that are in bloom, generally for about 60 seconds per plant. So during that 60 seconds, we're counting pollinators that are either on that plant already or are coming to land on that plant. Most often it's the inflorescence or the plant as a whole in some cases. But they're counting the totals of pollinators. Sometimes we're looking at specific groups. Sometimes it's any insect that's going to this plant that's landing on this inflorescence is counted. And in most recent trials, plants that are attracting high numbers of insects are actually getting bonus points awarded to them at the end of the evaluation. So which is really important to us. We want to be able to tie together plants that aren't just looking good, but are actually able to do something more to be able to support wildlife in a home landscape situation. So there's a few plants and a few situations where plants may have been tied, performed really both admirably well in a garden condition, but because of that pollinator score, one plant was elevated to be above the other one. And those are the plants that we get really excited about, plants that look good and actually do something for the environment as well.
Yes, exactly. And so let me make sure I understand this. For most part, the pollinator and wildlife score is primarily focused on insects.
Yep.
Because that's what we're mostly attracting to our yards, because our yards are small for the most part. You might get some birds coming through and feeding and some other things like that, but insects are the big category that we can do a lot of good with. But then it's kind of looking at insects and flower visitors as a whole, not necessarily saying really good for this species or really good for that species or group of insects even.
Right. So we've done a little bit of that, and it's something that I think you will see us do more of in the future. So right now we're able to tell you that it's attracting a lot of insects, and it's very rarely broken out into what types of insects or this species in particular is really benefiting from this cultivar, this species. The best we have done, or what we've really done recently, is kind of broken out into categories, saying like with the phlox, we looked at butterflies only. So we wanted to know which plant was attracting the most butterflies, whether it's species or cultivar or Phlox paniculata. And that's how we looked at that. But most recently, we've actually been looking at some pollinator specialists. So in addition to looking at the overall insect numbers, so everything that's coming to those plants, we're also starting to hone in on specific groups of insects that are coming to these various plants in the trial garden.
And that makes sense because that's really what the research as a whole and the scientific community as a whole has always done, is looked at the big groups. And then now, in more recent years, it's starting to narrow down a little bit, but it's hard to do that. I mean, you can only do so much, any one person or any one research project. So yeah, I mean, that makes sense that it would be like that. And then you're primarily looking at, it sounds like, the adults. You're not looking for caterpillars and host plant usage.
Not yet, although we are planning to do that. So we just planted a milkweed trial, and that's going to be a major component of that evaluation. I mean, we've always told the story about what's a good garden plant, and that's really how these trials started. There really wasn't a wildlife component in the early evaluations at all. And slowly we've been incorporating more and more of that ecological side of these trials, trying to measure the wildlife value of these plants, which in many cases is a lot more than just their ability to attract and support pollinators. There are other ecosystem services that these plants are performing, even in a garden situation, that we don't really understand or maybe difficult to measure. But we're looking at ways to gauge that, to measure that. And in particular, it's going to be very important with the milkweed trial. We're really very interested in, we have these 25 different milkweed species and cultivars, all commercially available, all commercially sourced. Which ones of these plants are, whether it's cultivar or species, can support monarch caterpillars and monarch adults the best. So if you really could only pick one milkweed and that's all you have room for in your home garden, this is the plant to pick. And that's what we're really trying to drive people towards.
And I love the way you guys are approaching this, because it's naturally growing and evolving as you learn more, as the science learns more, as everybody learns. It just kind of naturally evolves and develops. And of course, we can always say, oh, but what about this? And I want this. But that's science. That's life.
Right.
There's always more. And we've got to start somewhere. And you guys are giving us that start. And that is so awesome. It's so amazing. So thank you guys for all of the great work that you're doing with all these different trials.
Of course, it's a lot of fun. It really is.
I bet. So let's kind of dive in with the Carex trials, because that's the most recent one that you guys just wrapped up. But we should probably, you and I are both speaking the Latin here. We should probably define Carexes. Do you want to do that, or you want me to do it?
Sure, I'd be happy to jump into that. So Carex are a really huge genus of grass-like plants that are in the family Cyperaceae. So they are commonly referred to as sedges, although there are other genera within the Cyperaceae that are also referred to as sedges. But within the sedge family, or the Cyperaceae family, Carex is the largest genus. They do look like grasses, but they have some features that will separate them out from similar grass-like plants, such as true grasses or rushes. There's a common rhyme, which I feel like I've said quite a lot lately, but it's a good one that kind of calibrates yourself, and it's easy to remember. And it's a good way to remind yourself of, what am I actually looking at? Taking a look at some of those key features that even if you're out in the field or in your home garden, you can kind of zero in on what kind of plant you might be looking at. So with Carex and other sedges, if you were to split open their stems and look in the insides, the stems are triangular and they're solid. So they have 3 edges. So sedges have edges is the first part of that rhyme. Rushes are round, and this is referring to the Juncaceae family, or the Juncus is a very common genus within that family. They are round stems with kind of a spongy pith-filled center. And then grasses are hollow, or grasses have joints, which refers to their nodes. So if you open up a grass stem, they're hollow, and they also have these large swollen nodes or joints up and down their stems. So when you split open a stem, remembering that rhyme, sedges have edges, rushes are round, and grasses are hollow is a really great way to start. So if you see that solid triangular stem, you know you're likely looking at a carex or at the very least a sedge. And then determining whether the sedge you're looking at is truly a carex, there's some other key features that the carex have that can get you a little bit farther in that as well.
Yeah, and that rhyme, I've said it for
Yes.
years.
Yes, exactly.
And
Yeah.
I still say it as soon as I start to go for a grass-like plant, in my head, as I'm touching it, I'm going through the rhyme.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and so Carex are a huge and very diverse group of plants. They can be found around the world. And in some ways, they're incredibly diverse, both in the number of species that are out there. I think in the state of Delaware alone, we have 137 species native to Delaware, which is amazing. There are hundreds of species native to North America, a couple of thousand species native worldwide. You can find them in habitats and environments that are tremendously diverse. There are carex that occur in alpine areas. There are carex that occur kind of where I would have thought about carex growing in kind of shady, wet areas. And there are carex that even grow on sand dunes on beaches. So there's this huge diversity of habitats. But in a very interesting way, carex are not very diverse at all. So they are all herbaceous perennials, which is very interesting when you think about large plant families like the Poaceae, for example, so the grasses. You have annual grasses, you have perennial grasses that are cool season and warm season, and you even have woody grasses if you think about bamboo. But with carex, they are all cool season perennial plants, which is really, really interesting. All these thousands of species out there, they all have that in common. But they are a tremendously diverse group of plants. There are, small plants that want really dry soils. There are large plants that want really wet soils. There's really everything in between. So there really is a carex for every home garden situation that you can possibly imagine, which is really exciting. This is a genus that can kind of do it all. And I think about it as a really great problem-solving group of plants in a garden situation.
Right. And like we said at the beginning, it's one that we haven't looked at or thought about using as much in our gardens a lot of times. And they're really gorgeous too. I mean, some of these carexes have these amazing seed heads. That's what I always think of when I think about the carexes, are the seed heads that they can have.
Absolutely. So even in our trials, when we were rating these plants, we were kind of rating them as a plant overall. We weren't really giving extra points to the blooms in particular or the fruit in particular. It was all just kind of folded into that overall score. And it wasn't given kind of additional points for having beautiful flowers or beautiful fruit. But some of these carex, they are truly spectacular in flower and in fruit. The flowers in most carex tend to be pretty short-lived, but that display can be incredible. But then the fruit can last for a long period of time. We have Carex grayi, Carex granita, some of the most beautiful fruit in the entire trials. They'll last all summer into fall, and they add a lot of texture to your plantings in addition to all of what the foliage can provide. And I really think of Carex as kind of the backbone to your plantings. And it's not just shade. They can be planted, a lot of these species can be planted in sun, they can be planted in shade as well. And they really give you this opportunity to use a plant is kind of like a combining feature that you can use in both sun and shade that will kind of unify a design together. Yeah. Anyways, you can tell I'm a little excited about Carex. They're great plants.
Oh, yeah. And I love hearing that too, because I've always tended to think about Carex and your sedges as being your wetland. It doesn't have to be swampy, but you have to have moist, was kind of my thinking, even though I do find Carexes occasionally up in the dry open woods. They're little short things and they're cute little things, but they're not what I think of as sedges. Right. And so, yeah, when I was looking at the trial, I was like, yeah, wait a minute. And it was reminding me just how diverse sedges can be, which, yeah, it's like, okay, why haven't we used these before? Right. And why haven't we thought about these more? But so why did Mount Cuba decide to do a trial on Carex? Because, I mean, there's a million different groups that you guys could have picked from. And you've got some really cool ones going on. You've done some really cool, flashy ones. And then there's Carex.
Yes. So it's a very kind of different flavor, if you will, from like you see some of the previous reports we did an evaluation at echinacea and hydrangea, and it's extremely colorful and the blooms are in your face. And it's like, how could you not love these plants? But Carex is a little different. It's not quite that centerpiece plant that's going to draw your eye immediately if it's in a mixed planting, although, I mean, may not be the same for me. I might be looking at the Carex rather than the echinacea. But when we start planning out these trials, That planting process takes a couple of years, even before those plants end up in the trial garden. And a lot of that is planning for the trial. It's accumulating plants, whether we're buying in plants or in some cases wild collecting some of these plants. If, say, a genera is not well represented in horticulture, we might need to supplement that with some wild collected material. In the case of this trial, it was a little bit of both. So we bought in a lot of plants, but there was a handful that were provided by our state botanist, Bill McAvoy, some plants, some Carex species that are native to Delaware, that are not in cultivation, we felt maybe had some commercial potential as well. But as far as when we're planning trials, they kind of fall into two buckets for me. One of them is, okay, here's a plant that's really well represented in horticulture. There's a ton of choices, and I'm thinking about something like Echinacea, for example. There's so many cultivars out there, they're all available, but how on earth do you make a choice between all these 70 different cultivars or whatever you can see when you go out to a garden center? How are you going to make that decision? And that's part of why we do these trials, is to try to make that decision easy for you, or at least give you the tools to make those informed decisions. Out of this huge field of all these different Echinacea cultivars, I think we looked at 70 different ones in this latest evaluation. We're able to tell you the 10 that were really good, long-lived, and in many cases had some wildlife value. So again, making those good informed decisions on something that is popular, there's a lot of, but maybe there's some answers to some questions that we can provide. But with Carex, they kind of fall more into this other bucket for me. And these are plants that we feel are really valuable that maybe aren't as represented in horticulture. And we feel that we can give a little bit of a voice to this group of plants and to show people how valuable that they are and show them how to successfully incorporate them into their home gardens. And Carex, there were some that were available. A lot of them, again, were commercially purchased, but I think there was kind of a lack of information about how to use them as well. So we felt that we could be a champion for Carex. And there seemed to be a slow movement as far as the amount of Carex that were being used in landscapes. We wanted to capitalize on that and to be able to provide information maybe when that movement had kind of reached its peak and when information about how to use these plants was really going to be in demand, which I think we came close to doing. I think it really has become, Carex are becoming much more popular, and hopefully we're able to provide some answers to questions that people might be having about them.
I like that too, because you're looking and seeing the gaps. And how
Right.
can you best help and serve and give us the information that we need as homeowners and people wanting to start incorporating more native plants? So very helpful. But yeah, when you look at the list of other trials that you guys have done, and then it's like, okay, now why Carex?
Right.
Because it doesn't quite fit when you just look at it from the showy perspective.
Right. It's much more like the utility aspect of things and, again, problem solving. There's just so many Carex out there, and showing people that diversity, showing people what they can accomplish with this single genus in their gardens. And with Carex, it's not about just planting one or two like with hydrangea. It's about planting many, and you can incorporate many, many different Carex, both in numbers of a single species or multiples of different species together, and really create these beautiful dynamic plantings. And they really can carry a planting just through that texture and that presence. And a lot of them are more or less evergreen, so that there's a presence in your garden, there's some interest for an extremely long period of time. And that's something that not a lot of other perennials in your home garden really can do.
So, how are some of the ways that you see using the sedges and the gardens and landscapes?
Yeah, I think they're a really great companion plant. A couple of ways that I really like to use Carex at home, especially with things like Carex pennsylvanica, is I love to use this as kind of the base layer of my plantings in a lot of situations. This is a species that's going to not get very overly tall, so it's not going to overwhelm other perennials that you might have in your garden, and it's going to kind of weave through the base of these other plants. And all throughout, while it's doing that, it's going to help retain moisture at the soil level. It's going to keep the roots cool of your other plants, and it's going to help suppress weeds. And it's also going to reduce the amount of maintenance as far as mulch applications that I'm going to have to do in my home garden. I like to kind of create these living matrices with Carex, and they really do an excellent job at that. And it just gives you another dynamic layer to your garden. It makes things look more interesting. There's more depth, there's more texture. And you can accomplish this with many other Carex species, not just with Carex pennsylvanica. And again, I mentioned that there's a lot of Carex that do really well in shade and sun. You can use that as kind of a unifying element to tie in those two different plantings together. If you have a sunny western exposure to your house and a northernly exposure to your house, you can use this single species to tie those two plantings together. And again, there's not a lot of other plants that can do that really successfully. And another really kind of unusual thing we were looking at with the Carex trial was looking at them as a possible lawn alternative. And there's many different Carex that you could use as a no-mow lawn. You're not actually having to maintain this very often. Maybe you mow it once in the spring, and that might be all you need to do to it. But there's a lot of Carex, these low-growing plants, low-growing species with finer foliage that really look beautiful. When mixed together, you can have multiple different species together, mixed with other non-Carex to kind of create this beautiful low-growing meadow that is really dynamic, has a lot more wildlife value than a traditional turf grass lawn. But we also were looking at Carex and their ability to be mowed. And several of these species actually handled mowing really, really well. In the last year of the evaluation, we mowed an example of each of the Carex, both in sun and shade, on a biweekly basis. So every 2 weeks, starting in May and all the way through August, we were mowing these plants at 4 inches. And what we found is a lot of the Carex tolerated it, but there was kind of a smaller group of plants that didn't just tolerate the treatment, they actually looked really, really good while doing that. So there is this kind of unusual niche that Carex could potentially fill as well, and kind of this mowed lawn alternative. If you really like that mowed aesthetic, there are some Carex that can do that for you. And I think about Carex as also maybe potentially filling in some trouble areas as far as lawns are concerned. Dry shade is one of those that comes to mind a lot, or planting in the root zones of, say, a maple. There are certain Carex that might be able to do that really, really well, where turf grass lawns may not be able to quite accomplish the aesthetic goals that you're going for in those types of situations. So I love Carex in naturalistic gardens, which is really kind of how I categorize my home landscape, but they have so many other areas of potential as well.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're saying, the living mulch, potentially mowing them and thinking of them as a yard. I hadn't even really thought of mowing them. I mean, if I'm going to mow, I may as well mow my grass. But
right. That's right.
That's just kind of the way I look at it. But other people have other ideas, and that's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then one of the other ways that I was thinking of potentially was liriope grass.
Yep.
You see that so often out
Yep.
there. I mean, this is another potential thing that you could use instead that still gives you that kind of the greenery, the grass, but then a lot of times you have those really cool nutlets and the fruits as well to go with it.
Yep, exactly. And sometimes beautiful flowers. And yeah, there's many alternatives to kind of traditional landscape plants. Liriope is certainly one that there's many different Carex alternatives that could take the place of liriope, even in large plantings like that. And I should mention, I've been talking about Carex being kind of a background plant and being a backbone to gardens and not necessarily the star of the show. There are Carex out there that are truly spectacular and could be used as a specimen. Think about plants like Carex cherokeyensis and Carex crenita. They have tremendous presence in the garden for a long period of time, and they really have this gravity to them that it's almost where your eye wants to go when you see them in a mixed planting. So there are plants that truly have this majestic presence in the garden as well as kind of those plants that are kind of the doers, and that you can plant 100 of them. They're going to provide a function, but they may not be the stars of the show. So there really is, even in landscape niches, design niches, there's Carex for every type of situation.
Yeah, and I want to get into some of these species too and talk a little bit about those, especially the ones that can do full sun and not necessarily wet, kind of the medium to drier side are some of the ones that really fascinate me. But before we get into specific species, how did you guys choose which ones to use in the trial? Because like you said, there's hundreds in Delaware.
Yes.
And that's where you guys are located at.
That's correct. Yes. Yeah, we're located in northern Delaware, actually very close to the Pennsylvania border. And the way we selected the plants for this trial is we kind of took a cross-section of what was available commercially. And if you think about, our trial was 70 different Carex species and cultivars, which sounds like a lot, but then you think about how many species are out there, even just in North America, and it's kind of a drop in the bucket. But this is what's commercially available. This is what's out there, what we could source. And there were also a handful, a little more than a dozen plants that were wild collected by our state botanist. We supplemented the trial with. And these were species of Carex that are native to Delaware that are not commercially available, that Bill and we thought might have some commercial potential. So we incorporated all those together. And this was really kind of how we started with this original field. that we started this trial with. And I should mention all of these 70 different Carex species and cultivars. There's 65 species, only 5 cultivars in this trial, so very species heavy. All of those plants were grown in both shade and sun. So we had examples of each in both conditions, and we wanted to, again, test their tolerances. In some cases, we wanted to see how plants would handle conditions that might be outside of their typical wild conditions where they're found growing naturally, and test their tolerances, test their adaptability in what we consider to be average garden conditions. So our soil conditions are more or less homogeneous throughout the trial garden. They are what I would consider to be average in the Mid-Atlantic region. It's kind of a clay loam, pH about 6.5, fairly moisture retentive, fairly high nutrients. It's kind of your average typical garden soils. So if you have similar garden or soil conditions to us, you're going to have very similar results in your home garden. But again, there's many Carex in the trial that would have preferred drier soils or maybe even more wet soils. So there's not a bad Carex. There's not a bad species out there. It's just right plant, right place. And as far as our place in the trial garden, we're really representing this middle of the road kind of average garden condition.
Since you kind of touched on it, we'll go ahead and jump into it now, because that was kind of one of the questions that I was going to ask later was, okay, you guys are in the Mid-Atlantic. So obviously you're testing for the Mid-Atlantic. You're testing soils, your climate, everything's kind of there because that's where you are. So it makes sense.
Right.
We're not all there. Do you have any tips for kind of expanding that knowledge? Where are the limits? Where should we start going? Okay, yeah, that works for the Mid-Atlantic, but maybe it doesn't work for deep south or further west, or I mean, we're all extrapolating out. We have to until we have the knowledge in our own areas. But tips and guidelines for how to apply this.
Yeah, so our results really are targeted primarily towards the Mid-Atlantic region, where our 2 big audiences are homeowners or home gardeners in the Mid-Atlantic region and the nursery industry. We want to be able to try to influence both or provide both parties with good information for them to make good informed decisions about what plants they're going to grow or what plants they're going to plant. In a lot of cases, though, I think that the results from our trials and the plants that we promote as top performers, that information may be relevant even beyond the Mid-Atlantic region in many cases. It's very interesting that, think about the trials at Chicago Botanic Garden, which their trial model and what Richard Hockey's been doing there is what our trial process was kind of based on. And it's interesting, we don't really coordinate trials, but often we are evaluating similar genera of plants. And when we do those similar genera, it's amazing how often the top performers from our trials or from their trials match up with each other. So in a lot of cases, I think a good plant is a good plant if you're looking at average garden conditions and cultivation. But of course, there's going to be considerations about cold hardiness if you're talking about Midwest or New England, or heat tolerance when you're talking about the southeastern United States. But I think about Delaware and where we are situated in kind of this Goldilocks zone. So we're kind of a convergence of north meets south, where a lot of plants that might thrive here actually might thrive a little bit farther north or might a little bit farther south. And the other thing you can do is kind of look at the origin of those plants. If we're promoting a plant that we think is doing really, really well, especially if it's a species, go online, check where that plant might be native to, or go on to our website. We often have information, descriptive information on our website about where that plant may have originated from, and look at where you're living and make those decisions based off of that as well. So, if you're living in California or in Texas, the information may not be as relevant to you, but some of the trends that we're observing might have some relevance to similar plants or similar categories of plants, not necessarily the plant itself, but looking at those trends, things like wildlife value, some of that data can be extrapolated a little bit and maybe applied to the plants that you might have on hand, your plant palette. But yeah, and if you're not sure, give it a try. That's a lot of the fun about gardening. And one of the things that I really enjoy about this job is experimenting, is trying these things, is observing how these plants are doing in very, very low input situations. So yeah, and if you have success with a plant that you think maybe you shouldn't, maybe a plant that's growing in the deep south that we've trialed, we say it's great, and you are living in Maine or Vermont and you try it out and it's doing great too, let us know. We'd love to know that kind of information.
Yes, because it just all adds information and data and helps everybody then to kind of know the parameters, know how far we can push things. If we're taking a species that tends to in the wild prefers that wetter soils, well, how dry can we go in the home setting?
Exactly. Yeah, and what we found with the Carex is in many cases plants were very adaptable. even beyond their typical, what we would consider their comfort zones. Or maybe these are just zones where these plants are able to compete best in the wild. But when taken out of that situation, they're given, space, there's low competition, the soils are average, they do pretty well. So in this relatively artificial situation, some plants might actually be able to perform surprisingly well, even beyond what we would expect from them in the wild.
And all the straight species that you guys tested, were they all native to Delaware, or where are they native to?
So not all were native only to Delaware. A lot of them were, but we kind of think of the Eastern Temperate Forest as our zone that we're taking plants from to trial. So I kind of think of our cheat sheet as, the Mississippi River and east are kind of the plants that we're focusing on in the trial garden. And that's a very broad scope of the term native, but it really does help us to incorporate a lot of plants into these evaluations. And it helps us to, if a plant's available in your garden center, we want to be able to tell you if you can grow it successfully. And, we tend to take that Eastern United States zone and pull from that as much as we possibly can. And we do make some exceptions. Sometimes we look at kind of the central United States, Ozark region, we'll pull some plants from that as well. But primarily Eastern United States is our focus.
That makes sense. You're doing a trial garden and you're trying to make it as accessible and usable to everybody.
Right.
So let's talk about some of these specific species.
Sure.
So we mentioned the dry and sunny. What are some of the ones that actually work well there?
So a few of these that really are quite adaptable to drier soils and full sun, there's some familiar faces in that group. One is Carex pennsylvanica. This is a very, very popular landscape plant. It's one of the top selling species in a lot of larger nurseries in this area on a yearly basis. And it does exceptionally well in average garden conditions. It does really well in shade, is actually a really great plant for lawn alternatives, but it can handle dry conditions really, really well. But it can handle full sun really, really well. So this is a plant that can do kind of everything. And it's just, it really is an exceptional species. One thing that we found with Carex pennsylvanica, which can be a good thing and a bad thing, is that it doesn't create really kind of solid mats of foliage. You're always going to have kind of a slight spacing between these small rhizomes. So the rhizomes are a little bit longer, these individual kind of clumps that originate from those growths. There's going to kind of be gaps between them. So there is opportunities for weed seeds to get in there to exploit those gaps. But in certain situations, that can be a really good thing. Not necessarily when we're talking about weeds, but if we're talking about short-lived perennials or annual native plants that you want to be growing and you want to be self-sowing in your landscape, things like Phacelia bipennitifida. It really gives these openings to some of these more delicate woodland plants. It's just a really great companion. It won't overwhelm them, and it will allow that seedling recruitment from those other species as well. If you're looking for really like serious weed suppression, Carex woodii is a really, really great option. And this was the top performing plant from the entire evaluation. It's one that everything we did to it, mowing, full sun, shade, it was just exceptional. So very similar plant to Carex pennsylvanica, and kind of a low growing mat forming plant. And it's really good at weed suppression. Just shorter rhizomes, denser mats. The foliage, when it comes up in the spring, kind of has this beautiful kind of blue-green hue to it. And this is one that the flowers are incredible. It blooms with these kind of straw-colored flowers that are held above the foliage in kind of late April, early May. Some of them are actually starting a little bit earlier this year, but it's a spectacular species. Unfortunately, it's not very commercially available yet. We're hoping that the nursery industry is catching on to this plant. We've been promoting it and saying that this is a great plant, you should grow this. So I think it will be out there, it will be available to homeowners, and it's one that does a lot of great things for a home garden. It can be that living mulch layer, it can weave between taller plants, help suppress weeds, and in addition to all of that, it's a beautiful, beautiful species. So that's one that we really, really liked, and it can handle some drier soils as well.
How tall do those get?
The top end of where those plants will get to in the early spring is about a foot, but that's really on the high end. That foliage tends to bend over, I would say 8 to 9 inches is going to kind of be the height that plant is going to be for the vast majority of the year. The foliage will kind of lodge over and create this kind of sweeping look to it. So not very tall at all. Again, good candidates for a no-mow situation if you wanted to have that as a lawn replacement. It's never going to get much taller than that, and it's going to continually grow through these rhizomes to kind of knit together and expand the clumps that it was planted in.
Yeah, because height is always something that everybody's looking for. So what are those short ones?
Another one, this wasn't a top performing plant in the normal trial, but it actually was a great plant as far as the mowing trial went. It was Carex eburnia. This is a plant that can grow very dry. It's a very, we call it a clump forming plant, although it can produce rhizomes after several years in the ground, but it's not going to be spreading nearly as quickly as Carex pennsylvanica or Carex woodii, but very fine texture. It looks a lot like a fine fescue. It has interesting flowers, but the nice thing about its flowers is they bloom in kind of mid to late March for us. So very early, and it kind of is a reminder that, life is there, spring is coming, and it's a lovely species. It can take very dry soils. This is one that I would say would be a good candidate for, planting in those maple root zones and places like that. If you really want that kind of grassy texture and aesthetic, Carex eburnia would be a really great option. And then another Carex species that can handle that dry shade really, really well is Carex albicans. This was one that performed really well in the trial, so it did well in the average garden soils in both sun and shade for us, but it can handle drier soils. And it has this beautiful clump forming habit, fine texture. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Sporobolus or prairie dropseed and that kind of similar aesthetic, that kind of flowing foliage. And albicans is great if you have average to dry soils. And we have other Carex in the trial garden, like Carex bromoides, that gives you a very similar aesthetic, but is maybe better towards the average to wet end of the spectrum. So there's different species that you can combine or use for different conditions that are going to give you a very similar aesthetic.
And the ones that are dry shade, the ones that would
Yep.
probably do well under maple. And maple is just a whole different layer of shade
Yes,
and
it is.
dryness there.
It
I mean,
is.
I know that's something that I get asked about a lot of recommendations for that type of a situation. Are they pretty readily available?
Yeah, so with the exception of woodii, but I'm sure that will become commercially available soon. Carex pennsylvanica is available, albicans is available, and eburnia is out there. Maybe not as widely available as the others, but you can find them. Actually, I should mention most of the top performing plants that we evaluated are commercially available in some form.
That's good too, because it can be hard sometimes to find some of the species that you hear people talking about,
Yes.
not just with Carex, but with anything. And then with Carex, again, not being the first group of native plants that we often think about. I mean, they can be a little bit harder to find, at least around where I'm at, it seems
Right.
like.
Right.
So, yeah, finding them's always
Yes.
a challenge.
Yes. And that's getting better. There's a lot of really great nurseries that do grow Carex. Like you think about the Hoffman Nursery in North Carolina, they grow grasses and Carex, and that's what they do, and they do it really, really well. And they are a wholesale nursery, but there are some nurseries out there like Izel, IZEL, which is actually kind of acts as a hub for a lot of these wholesale nurseries. Homeowners like myself can buy a lot of these plants that wouldn't necessarily be available to homeowners in bulk. So I could buy a flat of Carex albicans, for example. I'm not sure if that's on their availability, but I could say that, I need a flat of this for home. And the Izel is a really great place to be able to do that. So the gaps of availability are kind of being filled and it's getting easier, although there's still some ways to go, I think, as far as, getting Carex into the hands of home gardeners.
That's good to know. That is very helpful because I know that's something that everybody is always asking for. And something that I look for too. I mean, I grow some of my own, but then there's also plants I'm like, I don't have that one. Where do I get that?
Right.
And yeah, trying to figure it out can always be a challenge.
Yep.
So knowing where other people are getting them is always helpful.
That's right.
Yes. So what was your favorite?
Oh my gosh, that's hard. That's like picking a favorite child. I think just from aesthetics alone, I think Carex woodii was one of my favorites. Just a striking plant, in bloom. And again, I think about Carex blooms as kind of a bonus, but Carex woodii in bloom is spectacular, and it kind of holds its own amongst any other spring perennial. You can mix it with phlox and tiarella, and it would just be right at home in that situation. I think it's just a spectacular species. I think another one that I really, really like is Carex cherokeyensis. And this is a plant that's native to the southeastern United States. And it just has this incredible presence in the garden. It's a larger species. It gets to be about 3 feet tall, about 3 feet wide. Just really deep, dark green foliage. The foliage has this beautiful, thick texture to it. And it's very close to being evergreen, especially if you were to situate that plant in an area where it doesn't get a lot of winter sun or harsh winter sun. That plant is probably going to be as close to evergreen as any of the Carex in the trial garden. And it's just spectacular. Like it's another one that you could use singly as a specimen, you could use in mass. It's a really, really beautiful species.
That one sounds interesting. I'm not familiar with it, but I need to kind of look at that a bit more because I'm thinking of situations where maybe somebody wants some sort of like an ornamental grass, but doesn't want it to spread like grasses can sometimes spread.
Yep.
Would that be a pretty good thing to look at and think about with that one?
It would be a great one. So this is a clump forming species, and you'll see some seedlings germinating, some recruitment, but it's not going to overwhelm your garden. We actually found that Carex cherokeensis is somewhat slow growing to get started. Again, I keep referring to Spiralis heterolepsis, another pretty popular warm season grass that it takes a couple years to kind of get its feet under itself and to get really established. Carex cherokeensis is very similar in that way, but once it gets there, it's just incredible. So it takes a little bit of time, but would be a really great alternative to ornamental grasses. There is a handful of other Carex that I think would fill a very great similar niche to that as well.
And is that kind of pulled out in the trial report on some of those?
Yeah, so we have little like cheat sheets in our trial reports that are little cheat guides in here that kind of give you an idea of how it did in both shade and sun, but we also give them size categories. We talk about its habit, so if it's clumping, spreading, all that good stuff, whether it has evergreen foliage, semi-evergreen, whether it's a deciduous plant, all of that's in there. So it's just kind of a quick reference. And I should mention, as far as spreading and spreading by rhizomes, some Carex, I think, have kind of a bad reputation for, quickly colonizing areas, maybe being too aggressive. But we found that the vast majority of Carex do not do that, at least in the trial. We had 70 different Carex in the trial, and I think only 5 of them spread by rhizomes. So a very small number, the vast majority of Carex in our evaluation are clump forming and are quote unquote well-behaved in cultivation.
Yeah, because that's important to know, especially when you're talking a small garden area, a home area that you want or need it to look neat and well managed. Knowing the ones that are going to behave well in those situations and knowing the ones that aren't is important.
Yep. And the ones that, maybe are aggressive, there's a place for them. And again, there's no bad species out there. It's just right plant, right place. There's a couple species. Actually, one of our top performers was Carex amorii, spreads incredibly quickly under the right conditions, multiple feet a year, and it can colonize an area very quickly, especially in a sunny, wet situation. So this would be a really great candidate for maybe colonizing a wet ditch at the side of a road, erosion control. There are major positive implications for the species, but maybe just not in a small home garden where, other things can be overwhelmed. But again, it's just making those good informed decisions. It's a great plant, but just siting it correctly is going to be important.
Yes. And like you said, that's important with any type of plant you're looking at. I mean, some of my favorite native flowers, herbaceous perennials, are extremely aggressive. And it's like, okay, I mean, I've had one species in one of my small gardens and I'm like hating myself for it 7 years later, but I love it. And yes, I want to find a better place for it. It's just eventually it's coming out of that garden area and it's going somewhere where it can be with more aggressive plants and they can bully it out and fight amongst themselves and they'll sort it out and be just fine, but not in the garden area.
That's right.
But what were some of the surprises that you found?
I think really the surprises were just how incredibly adaptable some of these plants were and how well the vast majority of the plants in the trial garden handled the full sun conditions. I came here kind of not knowing a ton about Carex. I knew maybe 10 species just from previous garden experience, but kind of being immersed in all these other species and cultivars of Carex was incredible. And kind of having my preconceived notions about, Carex wanting shade and wanting a lot of moisture were shattered almost immediately. And it was fascinating. And it was just, there was so much to learn right off the bat there. But it was kind of amazing to really see how well these plants handled what I kind of considered to be adverse conditions for them. And even when you go back and you research where some of these species originally come from or thrive in the wild, seeing some of those kind of exceed those conditions or, perform well in situations where you just wouldn't expect them to, I think that was really wonderful and exciting to see, and just realizing how useful many of these plants could be in a number of different garden situations. So that was really cool and very surprising. And I think the other thing that was surprising to me was the mowing trial. It was fun to do anyways, but seeing how well some of these plants tolerated that treatment was incredible. I would say 90% of the plants that we put through the mowing evaluation tolerated that treatment. So that means that the plants continued to live. They actually more than survived in many cases. But then it just came down to human aesthetics and what we want out of a turf grass lawn. But that's a pretty extreme treatment, and a lot of these Carex handled it amazingly well. And to me, I think that even has implications in the nursery industry. If you have a container crop of Carex that's overgrowing its bounds, you can cut that plant back pretty severely, and it's going to recover and it's going to look good in a relatively short period of time.
And knowing stuff like that's going to make it more likely to become more available in the nursery trade.
Right.
So what's next?
So following the Carex, we are actually preparing the garden beds now in the shade, at least under the shade structure that we have. Carex is going to be replaced with ferns. We've got about 60 different ferns that we're going to be planting. So not a genera trial, but kind of a plant category trial, if you will. And then we're going to have about 20 accessions of Tiarella as well, which I'm very excited about, especially from a pollinator perspective. We've been looking at the pollinator interactions of a lot of kind of summer blooming plants and fall blooming plants, but we so far haven't really looked at pollinator interactions in spring blooming plants, which is a critical time in the garden, especially if you think about overwintering queen bumblebees. This is a very important time for them. They need to come out and they need to be able to forage, recover their strength for the coming year. And it's going to be really interesting to see how many pollinators that are visiting the Tiarella, and then maybe even look at what species of insect are going to these plants that are blooming so early in the growing season. So that'll be really fun. And then the Carex in the sun was replaced mostly by the milkweed trial I mentioned before. And then we have a very small evaluation on Physostegia, or obedient plant. I think we have 14 or 15 different accessions, a lot of cultivars of Physostegia virginiana, trying to determine, which one might be the best one to choose. And then there's a handful of species out there that are commercially available, but not widely grown, that I think are just really fascinating. And we'll be looking at them from their garden and ornamental qualities, but also trying to determine which ones are best for pollinators.
Nice. You guys always have such good things coming up. So definitely have to look at those later.
Yes. And I should say things that are going on right now. So in addition to the oak leaf hydrangea trial, we have our goldenrods evaluation going on, our solidago evaluation, our ironweeds, our vernonia. And I think the trial that I'm most excited for is one that hasn't even happened yet. And this is pycnanthemum, or mountain mints.
Ooh.
So that's going to be replacing the vernonia. I am so excited about this. I love mountain mints. I think they're one of my favorite garden perennials, not just because, I think they're beautiful. They're kind of, a sensory plant. If you brush up against them, you get that aroma. But as far as pollinators are concerned, you just can't beat it. It's incredible. Yeah, Sam Drogi at USGS calls it native bee TV. You can just stand over it and just watch all these bees go crazy on these plants. I'm very excited about that trial. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, yes. That one's going to be one I'm going to be watching because, that's one that when I talk to people and they want native plants, especially if they're interested in bees, I'm like, you've got to look at the mountain mints. I mean,
absolutely,
they're amazing.
They are. And they're another one that has a little bit of a bad reputation for being aggressive, or, garden thugs, if you will. But there's a lot of species out there, and they're not all going to overrun your garden or overwhelm your beds. A lot of them are, quote unquote, well behaved. And we have many of the species native to Eastern United States that they will be in the trials. And we'll be looking at cultivar species and even locally native examples of those species. So it's going to be fascinating, a lot of layers to that, but a huge focus is going to be on the pollinator interaction on these various species and cultivars.
Yeah, I don't see mountain mints, at least in my gardens. They're no worse than bee balm or even echinacea, half the ones that we like to grow. I mean, don't put it with the daintiest ones, but they're average, they're medium of the road. And putting something like hoary mountain mint with bee balm is one of my big hacks, because the white of the hoary mountain mint leaves camouflages the powdery mildew of the bee balm.
Perfect. Yeah, I like that. I'll have to use that at home.
Yeah, that was an accidental find. And then I'm like, oh, I like this. So now it's like all the time, those two go together for that reason. Nice. I don't care about powdery mildew.
I know. And what's one of those sacrifices I'm willing to make this is a big aside, but in our Monarda trial, we found that one of the plants that did get some powdery mildew attracted the most hummingbirds of any plant in the entire evaluation. And to me, I'm like, well, I'm going to pick that plant. I don't care if it's got some powdery mildew. It's going in the garden. If I'm going to get hummingbirds, it's fine with me. So, yeah.
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, this has been really fun, really interesting. Do you have anything else that you want to share with us before we wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. So with Carex, I mentioned that we look at plants from two different perspectives in the trial garden whenever we are evaluating them. So we're looking at the beauty of native plants, but also the value. And the value of native plants or the wildlife value of Carex was hard to determine in this trial, just because most of the time we're looking at pollinator interaction, and most Carex are wind pollinated. So we're not going to see those same interactions with pollinators and the plants they're pollinating as we would see in, say, the hydrangea trial or the echinacea trial. Just because we're not seeing that pollinator interaction doesn't mean there's not ecological benefits and value that Carex are providing. So they're providing habitat themselves, they're providing cover for insects, invertebrates, a whole number of animals that, you'll see the animals benefiting from Carex in that way in your home landscape. Mammals and birds and other insects will actually eat the seeds themselves. Carex can be host plants to a number of different moths and butterflies. We actually saw that happening in the trial garden as well, which was fascinating. There's some really amazing wildlife interactions out there that you may not be able to see in your home garden, but there's one really cool story. We work with the state of Delaware to grow Carex stricta, which is then planted out in bog turtle habitat. And bog turtles are an endangered species, North America's smallest turtle. They only get to be about 4.5 inches long, and they use Carex stricta as their nesting site. So what we've been doing is growing Carex stricta, giving it back to the state, and we've actually seen bog turtles using those reintroduced Carex stricta as nesting sites to lay their clutches of eggs. So a very specific wildlife interaction with Carex, but it's just fascinating. These plants are not just static. They're not just taking up space and, looking beautiful and providing good garden value, but they're actually really going to provide wildlife value as well in your home garden. Difficult to measure, but definitely observable. So something to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, we sometimes get so caught up in pollinators and thinking just of the adult pollinators,
right,
too, and pretty flowers. And there's a world of other ways that those plants are valuable and other types of organisms that they're serving.
Totally. And when we started looking closer at those things, we started seeing those interactions, and it was just fascinating. There's a couple of quick stories in the evaluation on our research report that highlight that. And I should mention, if you're interested in our report, it'll be mtcubacenter.org/research, and you'll be able to find all of that.
Yes. And I'll have a link in the show notes to make it nice and easy for everybody. I'll have that for the Carex trial. I'll also have it for the Mount Cuba website as well and Facebook page. And if people have questions, is there a good place to get in contact with somebody to ask more questions about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would personally be happy to field questions about Carex. Love talking about plants. I don't know if that's if that was obvious or not.
Well, no, not at all.
Yeah, not at all. So, but truly, I'm happy to chat about this anytime. If you have questions about the trials, current, future, past, please feel free to reach out. My email is shoadley, and Hoadley's HOADLEY at mtcubacenter.org. Yeah, I'd love to hear from you. And if you're planning a visit, we'd love to see you. We're open from Wednesdays through Sundays. We opened on April 1st, and we're open all the way through November. And there's also a ton of ways you can interact with us, even in the off season. We have a lot of continuing education programs as well.
That is awesome. Thank you so much for talking with us today, and have a great day.
It was my pleasure, Shannon. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. I appreciate Sam taking the time to talk with us, and I appreciate the work that Mount Cuba Center is doing as well. Sedges may not produce the colorful, flashy flowers that we often think about and are drawn to when we are picking native plants to use in our home landscapes or pollinator and wildlife gardens, but they are definitely worth considering. Not only do sedges have their own innate beauty, but they can also serve so many different functions in the garden and landscape, including filling in some of those so-called problem areas or serving as a potential lawn alternative. As I wrap this up, I wanted to let you know that we have lots of exciting opportunities planned with Backyard Ecology over the next several months. If you want to keep up with everything going on in the Backyard Ecology world, then please subscribe to our emails. You can do so at www.backyardecology.com backyardecology.net/subscribe. And when you sign up for our emails, you'll receive a link to download a free ebook that explains why our familiar garden zones aren't important when it comes to gardening with native plants. That's just our way of saying thank you for your interest in backyard ecology. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yard and community.